Welcome to International Relations with Professor Pushpesh Pant. What we intend to do in this series of podcasts is to take up an issue every week, maybe 2 episodes in a week, and provide you the background of that event which has taken place, which is significant for international relations, analyze the issues for you, and look at the future, how it's going to unravel. And what we have chosen for the first episode is the completion of 1 year of the war in Ukraine. This is an event which has reshaped the global geopolitical structure. It has affected the fortunes of almost all the major powers, and India cannot remain unaffected. What is required in a case like this is to analyze everything from the basics. Look at the main actors, look at the historical perspective, see how the war has unfolded, what the fluctuating fortunes have been, what is at stake, and then try to understand what is happening. So welcome to International Relations with Professor Pushpesh Pant. The war in Ukraine has been the most significant event, described as the most significant event since the Cold War. The war has reshaped, as we said, the contours of geopolitics, not only in Europe, but around the world. Though the conflict has flared up in Europe, remain confined to Europe at the moment, it cannot be dismissed as a problem confined to the Western world. The impact of the Russian military intervention in Ukraine is bound to have far-reaching repercussions, implications in the context of global energy and food security. It is also indicative of the decline of major powers and emergence of regional powers. Most important is to look at the parties at war. On one side is Russia, which launched this special military operation, had a unilateral military intervention in Ukraine, a sovereign country, a member of the United Nations. So what is Russia like? Russia, you must compare the two belligerents, the invader and the defender, both at the same time. We tend to forget this most of the time. Russia is a transcontinental country, the largest in the world, stretching from Eastern Europe and Northern Asia. It covers 1.7 million square kilometers of territory, encompasses 1/8 of the Earth's inhabitable landmass, and is spread across 11 time zones. Its population is over 1.47 billion, including Crimea. It's the world's 9th largest economy by GDP and the 6th largest by price purchase parity. It also is a vast repository of natural resources. Russia has the world's largest proven gas reserves, the 2nd largest coal reserves, the 8th largest oil reserves, and the largest oil shale reserves in Europe. It is the world's leading natural gas exporter, the 2nd largest natural gas producer, and the 2nd largest oil producer and exporter. Import of Russian fossil fuels has led to deep economic relationships being forged with the European Union, China, and Eastern European states. The natural resources, let's have a look at the food security. Russia has the world's 3rd largest cultivated area. It is the world's largest exporter of wheat. It is the largest producers of barley and buckwheat, among the largest exporters of maize and sunflower oil, leading producer of fertilizers. So it goes without saying that when we have a look at this, the whole world is dependent to one extent or the other, perhaps with the exception of the United States, on its energy security and food security on what Russia produces. Let us take a look at the other party, Ukraine. It pales into insignificance at first sight when compared to Russia, its gigantic neighbor. But let's not forget that Ukraine itself is the 2nd largest country in Europe after Russia. It covers approximately a territory of 600,000 square kilometers. Prior to the ongoing Russian invasion, it was the 8th most populous country in Europe with a population of around 41 million people. Now, 41 million people may not sound a very large figure in India, where we sit, and our population is 1.35 billion people. But compared to the European countries, even the major powers have populations which are not very large. So Ukraine cannot be dismissed in terms either of territory or in terms of population in the context of Europe. Most importantly, strategically, it has a coastline extending along the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov to the south and southeast. And this is its bane. This is the curse for Ukraine, because this is the gateway to warm waters for Russia, and Russia cannot afford to have this gateway blocked. So it doesn't want a hostile Ukraine. It certainly wants a docile, very friendly Ukraine. So this passageway, and this is what explains Russia's annexation of the Crimean Peninsula in 2014. In 2021, agriculture was the biggest sector of economy, and Ukraine is one of the world's largest wheat exporters. So it is not as if Ukraine is insignificant in terms of size, population, or in context of food security of Africa, Europe, some countries in Asia. It is also useful to have a look at Ukraine's demographics. Ukrainian is the dominant language in Western Ukraine and in Central Ukraine, while Russia is a dominant language in the cities of Eastern Ukraine and Southern Ukraine. This is what marks a divide between the people of Slav origin having affinities with the Russian language, maybe also having religious belief systems which are closer to the Orthodox Church in Russia, but the rest of the Ukraine would not be sharing these affinities. Attitude towards relations with Russia between those identifying more with Ukrainian nationalism and the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, and those who live in Donbas region, predominantly Russian-speaking, and to the Russian Orthodox Church, have been the fault lines, so to speak, in Ukraine, but the two people have lived more or less peacefully historically. Relations with Russia went downhill sharply after 2013, when Euromaidan protests took place following the 2014 Revolution of Dignity, which led to removal of pro-Russian president and elections of two successive pro-Western presidents. Now you see, what some would say that this was the germination of democratic spirit. Others would say that this was a conspiracy of the West, if you are sympathetic to the Russians, and say that democracy was being artificially imposed in Ukraine from top, from outside its borders, to create a problem with Russia. But one must look at the shared but contested heritage of Ukraine and Russia. Both Russia and Ukraine claim that their heritage starts from Kievan Rus, the small Rus, a 9th century empire that united most of the Eastern Slavic and Finnic tribes and adopted Byzantine Orthodoxy in the 9th to 11th centuries. The two countries' shared heritage goes back to more than 1,000 years, to the time of Kiev, when Ukrainian capital was the center of the first Slavic state, Kievan Rus, the birthplace of both Ukraine and Russia. In AD 988, Vladimir I, the pagan prince of Novgorod and Grand Prince of Kiev, accepted the Orthodox Christian faith and was baptized in the Crimean city of Chersonesus. From that moment onward, as the Russian leader Vladimir Putin insists and recently declared, Russians and Ukrainians are one people, a single whole, they can't be divided. Ukrainians have obviously a different view of this. After the Mongol invasion of Kievan Rus, the histories of people inhabiting the territories of Russia and Ukraine diverged. The Grand Duchy of Moscow united all remnants of Rus northern provinces that evolved in course of time into the Russian state. But over the past 10 centuries, Ukraine has repeatedly been carved up by invading competing powers. The Mongol invaders came from the east, Polish and Lithuanian armies from the west, and attacked and occupied parts of Ukraine. During the period of Imperial Russian expansion, ever since 1793, Ukraine was annexed to the Tsarist Empire and colonized. Ukrainians have bitter memories of this period of Tsarist colonization, but probably the most bitter memories date back to Ukraine, when Ukraine fell under the communist rule. Ukraine suffered some of its greatest traumas during the 20th century. After the Communist Revolution of 1917, Ukraine was one of the many countries to fight a brutal civil war before being fully absorbed into Soviet Union in 1922. In the early 1930s, to force the peasants in Ukraine to join collective farming, the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin orchestrated a famine, a man-made famine that resulted in starvation and deaths of millions of Ukrainians. And afterward, the Stalin imported a large number of Russians and other Soviet citizens and settled them, many with no ability to speak Ukrainian, with few ties to the region, to help repopulate the East. Now, this repopulation of the East during the 1930s may be taken as when the partition of Ukraine, the seeds of partition of Ukraine were sown. Because Eastern Ukraine came under Russian rule much earlier than the Western Ukraine, people in the East have stronger ties to Russia. So some believe till the Russians invaded, when the Russians may have lost their goodwill even in this territory and have been more likely to support Russian-leaning leaders. Western Ukraine, by contrast, spent centuries under shifting controls of European powers. Now, one quick look at Ukraine after the collapse of the USSR. With the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, Ukraine became an independent nation. But uniting the country remained a difficult task. Western Ukraine, in contrast to the East, spent centuries under shifting controls of European power, had a mindset which was closer to Eastern Europe than the Eastern Ukraine, which was more or less an extension of the westernmost part of Russia. The Eastern population tended to be Russian-speaking, Orthodox, and different from the Ukrainian-speaking people who were Catholic. The transition to democracy and capitalism in Ukraine was painful and chaotic, and many Ukrainians at times, especially in the East, longed for the relative stability of the communist era. The famines were forgotten, the exploitation was forgotten, the security and stability which the Stalinist regime has brought was kept in mind. Relations between the successor states have remained disturbed ever since. After the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, the newly independent republics of Ukraine and Russia on surface retained cordial ties, but similar discontent was there. Ukraine agreed in 1994 to sign the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and to dismantle the nuclear arsenal which the USSR had left behind in Ukraine. Some believe that this was a major mistake. Had Ukraine been a owner or in control of these nuclear weapons, it probably would not be as easily bullied by the Russians subsequently. In return, Russia, the United Kingdom, and the United States agreed in the Budapest Memorandum of 1994 to uphold and maintain the territorial integrity of Ukraine. At that moment of time, Ukrainians felt that this guarantee was enough. In 1999, Russia signed the Charter for European Security, which reaffirmed the inherent right of each and every participating state to be free to choose or change its security arrangements, including the treaties or alliances. Now, remember in 1999, Russia was in a very bad state. It was almost on the precipice of anarchy. It was practically bankrupt. There were oligarchs which were in power, which were behaving like warlords. And it seemed that the disintegration of the Russian state, its implosion, was going to be there very soon. This is when Putin had taken over for the first time as the president in 1999. But when Yeltsin was in power, who nominated Putin as his successor, handpicked him, at that stage, Russians were not in a position to assert themselves, either their control on their East European satellite countries or constituent units of the erstwhile Union of Soviet Socialist Republic. So Ukrainians thought that when Russia was weak, these guarantees given in the Budapest Declaration and in the Minsk Agreement will be enough for them. The relations between the successor states are interesting. After the Soviet Union collapsed, several former East Bloc countries joined NATO, partly due to regional security threats such as the 1993 Russian constitutional crisis, the war in Abkhazia, and the First Chechen War, 94-96. They wanted to escape this state of anarchy from erstwhile Soviet Union, present-day Russia, then to spill over into their territories. So they opted for different alliances, which of course the Russians had agreed in 1999. The Russian leaders claimed that Western powers had pledged that NATO would not extend eastward, although this remains disputed. At the 2008 Bucharest summit, Ukraine and Georgia sought to join NATO. The response among the existing members was divided, with some European members concerned about antagonizing Russia. Remember that this was a time when the West was thinking that the weak Russia would try to integrate with European Western world economic system. It would try to join the process of globalization, and this economic liberalization in course of time would lead to political liberalism. It would lead to democratization of the Russian polity. This did not happen, but in 2008 the hope very much existed, and Putin, let's not forget, had been in power just for 2 terms, and he was about to make place for Medvedev, his nominee, as the president, when he would recede back as a prime minister. NATO ultimately refused to offer Ukraine and Georgia membership, but also issued a statement agreeing that these countries will become members of NATO subsequently. Vladimir Putin voiced strong opposition to the NATO membership bids, and the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said that Russia would do everything in its power to prevent the admittance of these countries, because the Russian concerns seem to be pretty legitimate. NATO had not been dismantled after the end of the Cold War, while the Warsaw Pact had been dismantled. The disintegration and dissolution of the Soviet Union had weakened. There was no communist bloc to contend with, and there was perhaps no need, no justification for NATO to continue as a military alliance system to check, block, resist Russia. So the Russian demand was the NATO should also be dismantled like the Warsaw Pact. This did not happen. Relations with Russia went sharply downhill after the Euromaidan protests. After the 2014 revolution, the pro-Russian counter-revolutionary protests erupted in southern and eastern Ukraine. This was followed by annexation of Crimea. Russians were very apprehensive that if they allowed things to continue like this, Crimea might fall outside their grasp at all. And the armed pro-Russian separatists seized control of the government buildings and proclaimed that the states of Donetsk and Luhansk are independent, sparking the Donbass war. Now, this was how Russia was raising the ante. The eastern Ukraine was becoming a disturbed area, tempted constantly by the Russia to join them. Crimea had been, for all practical purposes, annexed. Ukrainian government was constrained to recognize the Azov battalion, which had long acted as an independent militia with a fascist, often anti-Semitic ideology, but they were fighting against the Russian influence in the eastern Ukraine, and this prompted Putin to tarnish Zelensky's image and his regime as supportive of a Nazi ideology. Here, 2 things are worth noting. When Russia annexed Crimea, the rest of the world did nothing else. The Western power treated it as a fait accompli and conceded, so to speak, that Russia was not doing something which was illegitimate, although it was a gross violation of international relations, but it was taken as a fait accompli. And this is what probably encouraged Putin subsequently. Now, the prelude to the war, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, is since it was founded, NATO has expanded eastwards, closer to Russia in its sphere of influence. And Putin's argument always has been that there have been constant provocations by NATO to pose a threat to Russian security, its independence and integrity, and it cannot be tolerated. This is what he calls the red lines. If you look at the map, in 1952, Greece and Turkey joined the alliance. This was the first expansion. In 1955, West Germany joined NATO in response to the Soviet Union and 7 countries in Eastern Europe forming the 8-nation Warsaw Pact. But this is the height of Cold War. In 1982, Spain became the 16th member of the NATO. This is after the thaw in the Cold War. In 1994, this is much after, almost a decade after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Finland and Sweden joined NATO's Partnership for Peace program. The following year, they joined the European Union, effectively ceasing to be strictly speaking neutral, but they remained militarily non-aligned and were not granted the membership of the NATO. In 1999, 3 former Warsaw Pact nations, the Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland, joined NATO. Now, this, of course, was something which was causing alarm in Russia. In 2004, the biggest NATO expansion to date took place. 7 countries became members of the military pact: Bulgaria, Romania, Slovakia, Slovenia, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. The later 3 are the only former Soviet republics to have joined the alliance. So others were parts of the Soviet empire, so to speak, sphere of influence, its satellite states, you might call. If you go back to the Brezhnev doctrine, you may say that the doctrine had been propounded that there are states with limited sovereignty, but in fact, only 3 members of the erstwhile Soviet Union joined the NATO. They were Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. But at that time, Russia was not in a position to assert itself. In 2008, the NATO countries welcomed Ukraine and Georgia's aspirations to join the alliance. This angered Russia. In August, Russia won a short war with Georgia over the breakaway regions of South Ossetia and Abkhazia, which Moscow recognized as independent states. In 2009, Croatia and Albania became NATO members. Not again erstwhile constituent units of Soviet Union, but very much states in Eastern Europe under its influence. In 2017, Montenegro joined NATO. This is post-Crimean annexation of Russia. So you can see this skirmishing going on, Russia saying they don't cross the red line, NATO slowly digging its heels and pushing whenever it could push. Into 2020, Northern Macedonia became NATO's 30th member. In 2022, Sweden and Finland started exploring the possibility of joining NATO. In March 2021, Russia countered by building a massive military buildup up to 190,000 soldiers at Ukraine's borders. In November, Putin warned that Russia would be forced to act if the red lines had marked repeatedly NATO pushing towards its eastern border or Ukraine were crossed by NATO. Moscow would view the deployment of certain offensive missile capabilities on Ukraine's soil as a trigger. On 21 February 2022, Russia recognized Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic. The state assembly legislatures in these two semi-autonomous territories begged and passed resolutions that they would like to join Russia. The very next day, the Federation Council of Russia authorized the use of military force and Russian soldiers to protect these territories and their independence, and they entered. The invasion began 3 days later, on the morning of 24th February, when Russian President Vladimir Putin announced a special military operation seeking demilitarization and denazification of Europe. Now, this is something which has been debated endlessly since then. Why was it called special military operation? Now, one reason why it was called a special military operation was that the Putin wanted to avoid being branded an aggressor. He at that stage was worried about some resolutions in the United Nations which would say that it's against the Charter, the territorial integrity and sovereignty of a member of UN was being violated. And the second reason for calling it a special military operation was perhaps that the facade was that he was trying to undertake these operations to protect the Russian-speaking, culturally affiliated to the Russians, even religiously, the East Ukrainian territories from attacks by the Nazis and anti-Semitic forces in Ukraine. Now, this is ridiculous because Zelensky himself is a Jew whose family had perished during the Second World War in concentration camps, and to call him Nazi or anti-Semitic is ridiculous. But at the same time, one must keep in mind that there was an independent militia, the Azov Battalion, of people who subscribed to anti-Semitism, who were given to a fascist mindset, philosophy of like Nazis, and they were targeting the Russian-speaking, culturally closer to Russian people in the Eastern Ukrainian region. So there was an excuse which had, but I think also the miscalculation on the part of Putin was he thought that this would never reach the scale of a full-scale war. The special military operation will be a mopping up operation. There would be breakdown of the morale of the Kyiv leadership. Zelensky might run away, and before they knew what was happening, the Russian forces would have captured the Ukrainian capital. A many kilometers long file of tanks was deployed, shown, and this was partly battle of nerves to that this massive kind of a deployment would 190,000 people on the border, miles long file of the tanks would scare the Ukrainians. Most expected Ukrainian capital to fall, but the Ukrainians fought back dramatically and pushed the Russian troops back. The Russian offensive faltered. It was confronted with unexpected resistance. The patriotic zeal of the Ukrainians and the charismatic personality of Zelensky, who found his best hour in this moment of crisis, has meant that there has been a fluctuating fortunes of war. Both sides have gained and lost territory over the course of the year, but now the war appears to be at an inflection point. There is a general agreement that Russia lost the momentum. It has lost the war of perception. After the conventional land battles and airstrikes, the conflict has moved into attack via drones and precision missiles. Casualties have continued to mount, but boots on the ground are much less today. Now, how did this transformation take place? There was a lot of speculation, first of all, that the Russian army, large in size, mighty on paper, was not exactly a battle-tested army at all. It had lost its morale in Afghanistan decades back, and it was dependent on weapon systems, tanks, ammunitions, which have not been kept in the best of condition. And there also is allegations of corruptions in the army procurement of weapons, its maintenance. The generals did not have the strategic foresight. It was also argued that Putin took charge of the battles on the battleground, actual battlegrounds, which he had no competence to command at that level. And in any case, what happened, there were all kinds of speculations that the tanks would get stuck in when the winter came, when the ice and slush was there. The Ukrainians could strike down some of these tanks as sitting ducks. They could even shoot down some of the planes. And it appeared that the Russians were not prepared for a long-drawn battle. Then it was, of course, argued that there were quick changes of leadership. Generals were shifted. Wagner forces were mercenaries were put in place of, and there was conflicts between those two also. While the Russian forces were conducting warfare as an aggressor, invader in a foreign country, their lines of supply were constantly extending. They were working in a hostile climate, and the Ukrainians were fighting a battle to save their own country. So the morale was different. But then this had other repercussions. Ukrainians were given massive assistance by United States of America and members of the European Union, who thought that the Russians were trying to breach all conventional rules of international conduct. They were flouting international law. They were committing war crimes. They were targeting civilians, and Ukrainians had to be supported. But not all members of the EU share the same perspective on the Ukrainian war. Fissures within the multinational forum have surfaced. France continues to emphasize its strategic autonomy, is pretty restrained about offering assistance to Ukraine. Germany has been equivocating, though in recent past it has given up its anti-militaristic posture after the Second World War, has hiked up its defense budget, and also has been under pressure from popular opinion, being constrained to take a decision of giving tanks to the Ukrainians. The frontline states like Poland and Hungary are far more apprehensive about Russia's aggressive designs, but within them also there are differences. Hungary is closer to Putin's Russia. Poland is far more worried because it's a frontline state. What would happen due to influx of refugees? It might be next on the line of Russians. And even if the Russians don't invade it, there might be collateral damage, which it suffers if the bombing and missiles hit very close to the border. The Scandinavian countries have also ceased to be strictly neutral fence-sitters and have applied for NATO membership. The application of Sweden and Finland has met with strong Turkish and Hungarian resistance. So which means that one purpose, war objective of Putin has probably unintentionally served. There has been, European Union appears to be in disarray because earlier it was argued that all of them were very dependent on Russian energy and so on. What would happen if the winter is harsh? They would be brought to their knees and they would have to do a deal with the Russians. This has not quite happened. Whether one might say, thanks to the climate change or global warming, the winter was not unnecessarily harsh. They had stored up enough energy, the European nations, to cope up with this. And despite the interruptions of the Nord Stream being, for all practical purposes, being shut down, they have managed to survive the winter. And they have managed to find alternative sources of energy. But this is not the only issue. The there have been, because if the war is long drawn, various countries in Europe realize that they will have to pay a price for supporting Ukraine. It is not only the anger or the unpleasantness which the Russians might cause to them, there might be an economic cost which their citizens will have to bear, and their own security expenditure would become probably unbearable due to taxes and so on. Most people think that the Americans have precipitated this war, provoked the Russians to undertake this special military operation, have this war, and the war has practically destroyed Ukraine, but Americans remain backstage. They have given billions of dollars of assistance. They have put economic sanctions in place, but they expect the European allies to follow them blindly, which is not going to happen. So the relationship between the USA, the relationship between NATO and the European Union, and if the NATO is reluctant for whatever reason to cross the red line, they are worried about the nuclear trigger being flared up by Russia. Even if it's a tactical nuclear weapons, there is a hazard of radiation. Nobody wants to escalate. So if the NATO is not willing to take harsh retaliatory steps where Russians are rampant, can they be trusted to protect the rest of the member states when it takes place? Because the ironclad statutory provision that if one member of NATO is attacked, all the others would react as if they have been attacked has become suspect. The Scandinavian countries have ceased to be neutral fence-sitter, which we have said before, but this again remains a red line, not only for Russia, but also for other member states in NATO, like Turkey. So let's have a review of how the Russian invasion of Ukraine has fared so far, how the offensive has faltered and resistance has increased. In February 22, when the invasion began, tens of thousands of Russian troops tried to capture the Ukrainian capital. Wagner mercenaries reportedly were redeployed from Africa to assassinate the Ukrainian president, although the hope was that he would run away, take a safe passage to America. The European Union opened its door to hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian refugees. Some criticized the double standards shown by the Europeans to receive these Ukrainians who had blonde hair, blue eyes, fair skin, to those escaping the violence of West Asia and in Northern Africa. But this phase has passed. March 2022 onwards, there was a slowdown in the conduct of war. Food and energy prices rose around the world. Russian forces encountered stubborn resistance around Kyiv, had to withdraw. The advance started to splutter and stall. Grisly evidence of war crimes emerged as Russia forced pullback from areas like Kiev. Hundreds of bodies of civilians are found in the mass grave in Bucha. Now, what one must keep in mind is that these allegations of war crimes, violations of civilian rights have been targeted by one side and the other, both. And it is very difficult in a situation like Ukraine to find out what is the truth. More likely is that during the conduct of war, civilians pay the worst price, they are the worst casualties, and it is not always possible to conduct war keeping in mind the laws of war as the international law prescribes. So probably war crimes have been committed, but there's a different issue which we'll see how they can be coped with. April onward, one might say 2022, the second phase began. The Russians decided to have missile strikes, and one of the earliest missile strikes hit a train station in Kramatorsk on 8th April, killing at least 50 civilians. A suspected Ukrainian missile sank the flagship of Russia, Moscow, in the Black Sea field. Now you can see that this is Russians started using missiles, targeting civilians, creating havoc on the ground, but the Ukrainians could also at times, until that stage, strike at will the flagship Russian Moscow, and Moscow was left smarting. In the month of May, NATO regained its relevance. Sweden and Finland unveiled their bids to join NATO. Resistance to their membership continued from Turkey and Hungary, as we have noted before. But by June, the string of Western brands and businesses exited Russia as part of the sanctions imposed on Russia. But let's keep in mind that it is only the Americans and leading European brands and some Japanese brands which have exited Russia. Major Asian companies, and it's not only China, continued to operate in Russia. The global food crisis loomed. Millions of tons of Ukrainian grain languishing in silos since the start of war finally was lifted. Some arrangements were made courtesy partly Turkey that they could pass through and get down to where it was needed most. Ukrainian forces recaptured Snake Island, which was a major moral victory because it had been captured by the Russians in the beginning of the war. In July, began the Russian counteroffensive in the east. The last city in the eastern Luhansk region falls to the grinding Russian invasion. Inflation reached record highs in Eurozone. The euro and the dollar reached parity, which was the economic consequences of the war were becoming painfully felt in Europe. Russia begins to periodically shut down the Nord Stream, indicating to the Europeans that unless they were neutral in this war, did not aid Ukraine, they would have to pay an energy price. In the meantime, the Nord Stream was sabotaged, and the Russians said that this was a special operation done by the deep state in America. We will never be able to find out what happened, but this practically sealed the fate of the Nord Stream. And as we noticed a little earlier, commented a little earlier, Europeans realized that they could live without, at least in the short term, without the Russian fuels. And also they started looking for alternative sources of energy, falling back on the fossil fuels, alternative supplies of oil and gas, and even nuclear energy. Ukraine and Russia agreed in a landmark deal in the month of July, allowing Ukrainian grain to be exported across the Black Sea. HIMARS missiles from US began hitting Russian ammunition depots, logistics, command and control system. So it was not as if the Ukrainians were fighting a David versus Goliath battle. They were being armed with more than slingshots by their allies. In August 2022, the gas exports to EU stopped finally. Explosions rock an airbase in the Russian-occupied Crimean Peninsula. A suspected car bomb goes off in the Moscow, killing TV commentator Daria Dugina, a daughter of a conservative ultra-nationalist philosopher Alexander Dugin. Close to the Putin establishment, all gas exports to Europe were halted on 31st August 2022. In September 22, another wave of escalation took place. Russia declared partial mobilization. Now, no mobilization has been declared in Russia since the Second World War. Ukraine launched a rapid counteroffensive and made steady progress in the northeastern Kharkiv region, sending Russian units into retreat, shocked retreat. Zelensky came to the battlefront, raised the Ukrainian flag in the war-scarred city of Izium on 10th September. Putin announced as a response the partial mobilization of 300,000 troops to fight in Ukraine, triggering a mass flight, ironically, of Russians escaping conscription into neighboring Georgia and into Kazakhstan. Now, this gave a wrong signal to the Western world that the war was extremely unpopular in Russia, and soon there would be resistance against this unpopular decision to partial mobilization by the Russians. And this mobilization was very odd because it was not only able-bodied young Russians who were fit enough to serve in the army as a draftees, but also there was an offer made to convicts, prisoners, waiting on the death row, that if they volunteered to fight as part of this mobilization in Ukraine, and if they survived, they would be set free and they would be given a reasonable bounty. Now, almost 1,200 protesters were arrested in cities across Asia, but again, the protests never snowballed. They never took a size or a scale which could cause real trouble for Putin. Russia officially annexed Donetsk, Kherson, Luhansk, and Zaporizhzhia on 30th September. In October, there was another seesaw. A large explosion tore through a bridge linking Russia and Crimea, which served as a major supply route for Moscow forces fighting in Ukraine. Russia began as a retaliation, bombing Ukraine's energy infrastructure, knocking out power, and making its citizens freeze in winter. Now, the Russians also started targeting hospitals, theaters, shelters, maternity homes. Now, the argument runs both ways. The Russians claim that the Ukrainians were using these hospitals, schools, theaters as a shield to house their soldiers and special operations people. And these were also creating hit-and-run attacks, suicide attacks on the Russian forces. The Moscow also was upset with these targeted attacks on Russian supporters of Putin, or at will destruction of a bridge connecting the Russians with Crimea. So this seesaw battle continued in October. In November, Ukrainian troops poured into Kherson on 11th November and liberated it. A blast in Poland near Ukrainian border killed 2 caused by a misfired Ukrainian air defense missile. This is what has been worrying Poland very much, that there might be collateral damage which Poland may suffer because of either Ukrainian mishits or the Russians' mishits. 2 low-flying Ukrainian helicopters crossed into Russian territory and fired on an oil depot in the city of Belgorod, 20 miles from the border. Now, this is something which caused great concern in Russia. This was the first time the Ukrainians had crossed the border and hit Russian territory behind Russian lines. In December 2022, there were indications of a grim spring. Zelensky headed to the US for his first state visit outside the country since the start of the war. We must remember that Zelensky has been very visible. He has been participating virtually, addressing United Nations meetings, General Assembly meetings, Security Council meetings, American Congress, his European allies in their partnership, their parliaments. But US President Joe Biden promised to send Patriot air defense systems to help Ukraine stave off Russian attacks on its energy infrastructure. The Russian strategy by this time was that, of course, civilian casualties were mounting, but the Russians knew that it was better for them to adopt a policy of unmanned aerial vehicles, drones, or high-precision missiles to target infrastructure and electricity supplies, or maybe even a nuclear plant which could create panic and bring Ukrainians to their knees. On Christmas Day, Putin claimed Russia is ready to negotiate with Ukraine. The Russian president publicly used the word war, referring to his country's invasion for the first time. Now, ready to negotiate is not necessarily signaling the will to bring the war to a peaceful conclusion. Both sides must have some face saving. How does Ukraine accept the loss of territory? However little it may be 20% of its total territory, and of course, Crimea's annexation before that, and devastation of the country, which may take many $1 trillion to reconstruct, and say that I'm willing to negotiate. So his negotiating position is that no loss of territory is negotiable. But if can the Russians be expected to vacate the territory for which they have paid such a heavy price in terms of Western economic sanctions, in terms of, some have estimated, more than 200,000 soldiers killed? The Russians have not lost civilian lives, but Ukrainians have lost probably civilians which are many more than have been counted so far. And of course, 100,000 soldiers have been lost by a conservative estimate by the Ukrainians. But the loss of Ukraine in terms of total destruction of its infrastructure, its agriculture, is so acute that it is difficult to imagine that unless it is offered compensations, unless it is offered multilateral aid for reconstruction, it would not be ready to negotiate anything. In January 2023, Germany finally agreed to supply Ukraine with Leopard 2 battle tanks, paving the way for USA and other NATO allies to follow suit. Now, this is more or less a symbolic gesture, because by the time these tanks reach the battlefront, by the time the Ukrainian soldiers are trained to man them, and by the time weeks, if not months, will pass, and Russians would be pre-warned that this is what is going to be deployed against them. And if the Russians have already opted for the strategy of drones and high-precision missiles, then it is very difficult to imagine that this would change the scales of war. Almost as soon as the tank deliveries got the green light, Kyiv began asking for fighter jets, something with Chancellor Scholz flatly ruled out. Ukraine admits that withdrawing from the eastern town of Soledar, much to his regret, which indicates that Russians have made some inroads and firmed and reinforced their positions in at least some parts of eastern Ukraine. Russia and Belarus began joint drills in the month of January. creating apprehensions that in near future, Ukraine might face an attack from Belarus side as well. So there would be Russian pressure on the eastern side, there would be Russian pressure from the southern side, southeastern side, and now there would be an additional threat from the northern side from Belarus. Putin announced that Russia was suspending its participation in the New START nuclear arms control treaty with US. This is right after US President Biden made a surprise dramatic visit to Kiev, asserted very strongly his support for Ukraine as a defense of democracy and defense of a rule-based system, and trying to check an aggressor, Russia. But the Russians, by now, have probably made up their mind that whatever impact the international economic sanctions led by US could do, the damage has been done to them. They have found alternative customers for their oil. They may be selling their oil at a discount, and some of the Russian oil might be finding its way via third party even to European markets. So the sanctions have really not succeeded in breaking the will of the Russians or bankrupting its economy. They were kicked out of the SWIFT system. They were kicked out of the banking system. Their oligarchs were targeted. Anybody close to Putin was sanctioned. But all these sanctions have not made a difference. Actually, what has happened is Russians have drawn closer to Iranians. They have drawn closer to Chinese. The Chinese-Russian relationship is a complex one, has to be analyzed some other time in greater length and detail. But the Americans have not been able to drive a wedge between the Chinese or the Americans. People have speculated that the Chinese are watching very carefully what would happen to Russian military special operation in Ukraine. Does it have some lessons for them vis-a-vis Taiwan, Formosa? But as the much talked about massive Russian invasion offensive to commemorate 1 year of war crushing Ukraine has not taken place. The state of stalemate on the battleground continues. It is difficult to foresee any one side registering a decisive victory in near future. There are things which one must note of. The war has resulted in an unimaginable humanitarian crisis, as hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians were internally displaced and millions fled abroad. Neighboring Poland recorded the highest number of border crossings from Ukraine, over 9 million as of February 2023, followed by Russia, Hungary, and Romania. As of January 31st, 2023, nearly 18.2 million border crossings were recorded from Ukraine to other countries, starting from February 24 in 2022, when the Russian invasion had begun. Now, this refugee crisis is on the back burner at the moment, but it can flare up at any given time, because these countries where these Ukrainian refugees have taken shelter are not in a position to bear this burden. They have been very welcoming, very warm to begin with, but it also exposes them to the threat. Now is the time to have a look at the map closely. You see the map colored in pink broadly indicates the areas which continue to be under Russian control: Luhansk, Donbass, Mariupol, Melitopol, and further down Crimea. The one in bluish violet is the one where the Ukrainians have fought back and captured the area which was once controlled by the Russians. More or less, this is the state of affair before the Putin had ordered the special military operation. These areas were under effective Russian control, alienated from the rest of Western Ukraine. But right now, what we see after a year-long war and all these loss of life and infrastructure destruction, not much has been gained by the Russians on ground. It is difficult to imagine that they will make a push for either Kyiv or to control more land or territory because they would be occupying land which has been destroyed by them, facing the threat of partisan warfare, and become more and more bothersome for them to sustain this. So these are more or less tell you the fluctuating fortunes of the war. The same color code, the pink area is the one which the Russians have occupied, tried to control on the eastern bank of Dnipro River. You can watch that what was the situation in March, what it was in August, what was in October, and what it was in November. This gives you the broader, bigger picture. This is the all of Ukraine. So those other maps tell you the reality, ground reality on the battleground. This helps you appreciate that in the totality of the expanse of the territory of Ukraine, what little is occupied by the Russians. And also, Crimea had been annexed in 2014. So there is not much which has been gained by the Russians. And these blue arrows tell you the counteroffensive mounted by the Ukrainians and what they have captured. Time to count the cost of war. The OECD estimates that the world economy in 2023 will be 2.8 US dollar trillion smaller than was estimated in December 2021, before the Russian troops and tanks had swarmed into neighboring Ukraine. The US military estimates that 40,000 Ukrainian civilians have been killed, in addition to perhaps 100,000 Ukrainian military casualties, which I have referred to before. As of August 2022, an analysis of the economic costs and conducted jointly by Ukrainian government, the World Bank, and the European Commission estimated that the direct damage was just under US dollars 100 billion. For the world at large, the biggest cost from the Ukrainian conflict comes from rising energy and grain costs, particularly the US dollars 2 trillion transfer of wealth from consumers and business energy to fossil fuel producers. This is going to have consequences on the climate change. The ongoing war in Ukraine has cost 36 billion euros in environmental damage, and the Ukrainian, according to the Ukrainian estimates. The impact of war on India is multi-layered. India and Russia have shared a special relationship since the Cold War, and Moscow remains India's biggest arms supplier. In terms of crude oil supplies, it's become a more significant oil supplier than it was before the Ukraine war. Perhaps this is because of the price advantage. India can now get Russian oil at 30% discount. And as the Indian External Affairs Minister has made it very clear that India views everything from the prism of its own national interest, and what is of Western concern is not necessarily impinging on India. It should not be allowed to impinge on India's national interest. So India is protecting its energy security by buying the Russian oil despite the American and Western sanctions. Stockholm Peace Research Institute has estimated that between 2011 and 2021, in a decade, Russia accounted for 60% of weapons imported by India. Hence, India cannot escape the serious fallout of this war. There have been concerns that the Russians are themselves running short of war material. They have to worry about spares of their tanks, planes, etc. So they are importing drones from Korea and Iran. So can, under these circumstances, Indians think that the Russian supplies can remain uninterrupted for maintenance of the weapon system which they bought from Russia? On the sidelines of the September Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit in Samarkand, Prime Minister Modi told the Russian President, I know that today's era is not an era of war. This perhaps is the most explicit signaling by the Indian Prime Minister to the Russian friends that continued Russian acts of war in Ukraine are not acceptable. India doesn't approve of this. If the Russians have an outstanding issue with Ukraine, this should be settled diplomatically, not through military means. It's been difficult to maintain a non-aligned stance and a tightrope balancing act. India cannot alienate Russia. It cannot afford to let Russia go entirely to the Chinese sphere of influence. It's interesting that people are not talking of Chinese sphere of influence, not the Russian sphere of influence to which China belongs. India definitely doesn't want the world to be divided again into two hostile blocs. India continues to rely heavily on West for its technology, especially high-tech, but the West has been reluctant to, or less forthcoming than Russians, to give the high-tech arms to India to secure its borders. It doesn't want to antagonize China beyond a certain measure. It wants to put India in front to countervail the Chinese aggression in South China Sea, in Pacific, in South Asia, but very little concrete assistance in terms of military hardware of the first-rate variety is available. The oil and defense, there was an initial criticism by European Union members, but the Indian External Affairs Minister made it very clear that India would buy cheap oil from wherever it gets according to its interest. It certainly is not going to let Western worldview impinge on its national interest. With India at the helm of G20, the West might lobby India to play a bigger role and criticize the Russians. But let's see what is the reality of the Western support to Ukraine. You can see Canada has supplied weapons worth 1.2 billion, and maximum is United States, which is 18.1 billion. Right after that is Germany, 4.1 billion, United Kingdom, 3.5 billion, and Poland, which is 2.3 billion. This is what we look at it. The reality of the aid given to from February to November, you can see only one frontline East European nation, Poland, one major member of the European Union, Germany, and bulk is United States. Canada, very close ally of United States, seems to be an extremely reluctant one. You don't see France anywhere here at all. So I think the Indians will have to keep in mind that as the war unfolds, the stalemate continues, it will have to take decisions in its own national interest on its own. It's going to be difficult diplomatically, but certainly possible for India, as the past year has shown. There will be greater pressures as we draw closer to the summit, the G20 summit, but Prime Minister Modi has successfully changed the narrative of G20 and tried to make it a voice of the global South. So what would happen is that Europe and America would probably, despite their economic wealth and their developed economies, would not be in the majority in G20, and probably India would be in a position to make a more substantial, successful effort towards the restoration of peace.